Good number present. We have visitors. We're glad that you're here. Hope you can come back and be with us again in future studies and future worship that we might have. It is not unusual for people to wave the white flag of surrender and just give up. That happens in a number of things. The student may give up on their education and they drop out of school. The worker gives up on his job and he just quits. A couple give up on their relationship, and so they break up. Husband and wives give up on their marriage, and they end in divorce. In each case, they're waving that white flag of surrender and saying, I'm giving up. But it's also true that children of God give up on their service to God, and they just quit. You've seen it happen a number of times. We've had people from our midst just to finally wave that flag, and they give up and they quit. You've seen it in the past. Perhaps you're thinking of people that you see in the near future that looks like maybe they're about on the verge of quitting. Maybe there's someone in your family that you're concerned about. They've already waved that flag and they've quit. I want to suggest to you that many reach the point they are just absolutely tempted to quit, or at least they're discouraged. Let me give you some examples of that. Elijah was such a man. Turn to 1 Kings chapter 19. 1 Kings chapter 19, as his life is being threatened, you remember how that Jezebel had made the promise that she was going to kill him as soon as she could. Verse 2 of chapter 19. Later at verse 10, he said, I alone am left. He felt so low that he thought he was the only one trying to do what was right. Notice at verse 4, he said, it is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I'm no better than my father's. I'd just soon die. About ready to quit. Let me give you another example. In the case of Paul, I'm not so sure that we should say he's ready to quit, but at least he was discouraged. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning at verse 8, he said, for we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble that came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. Holman's Christian Translation said we were completely overwhelmed. We thought our life was gone. We were discouraged. We thought they had taken us. We were just overwhelmed. We were burdened. We were weighed down, the American Standard said. We were weighted down with discouragement. And no doubt it was the temptation to Paul. I know this to be the fact with reference to the Hebrews. Turn to Hebrews chapter 12. The message of the book of Hebrews was written to encourage people who are discouraged, who are ready to almost throw up their hands and quit or wave that white flag. Chapter 12, verse 12. Strengthen the hands which hang down and the feeble knees. They are beginning to buckle under pressure, and perhaps they're ready just to call it quits. That happens to a number of people. So this morning, let's talk about why people give up. Why people give up. I'm going to list 15 reasons why. They may overlap just a little bit, but each one may have a little different importance to you. Not every reason applies to every single person that may throw up their hands and quit. So what's the purpose of a study like this? Well, it may be that you're on the verge of quitting, and it may encourage you not to quit. It may be that you may begin to see some drifting in a direction so that you can say, you know what, if I keep going in that direction, I think I'll finally just throw up my hands and quit. I think I'll wave the white flag, and I don't want to do that. Or maybe there's someone that you're close to, that maybe it's someone in your family or some close friend who's on the verge of just becoming discouraged and quitting, and you can encourage them with some of these points. So why people give up? Here's the first reason. Because we forget how important a certain thing is. That's true of any endeavor. We forget how important that endeavor is. Things that are viewed as vitally important are pushed to the forefront for immediate attention. You recognize that. That which is viewed as important is not easily forgotten. For example, if there is a crisis with your child's health, they're screaming and crying about hurting, and you think, well, I've got to get them to the doctor because that urgency, that importance, puts it to the forefront, puts it on the front burner. It's not likely while they're screaming and kicking and crying, telling they hurt or they're bleeding, that you later say, you know what, I forgot to take them to the doctor. I just forgot all about that. I let that slip my mind. I just forgot all about the child being in danger. That which is viewed as vitally important is always pushed to the forefront. Let's go to John chapter 12 and in verse 27. John chapter 12, Jesus remembered the importance of his mission. And notice in John chapter 12 and in verse 27, he said, my soul is troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour. That is, I came to this world for this mission, and I'm going to fulfill this mission. He never forgot the importance of what he was doing. And so what I want to suggest to you is that we need to be reminded of how important our service to God really is. It is our sole mission. We're put here on earth and we're placed here on earth that we might fear God and keep His commandments. Furthermore, it has everything to do with our eternity. Look at Matthew chapter 25 and in verse 46. That in the day of judgment, when there is the separation from the right and from the left, Matthew 25 and verse 46 says, these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. That tells me the importance of the matter. So why people give up? Well, sometimes we forget how important a thing really is, and that's why we give up. Why is it that people give up? Well, secondly, we have not conditioned our hearts to face difficult challenges. We engage in an endeavor, and then we're surprised that there are some difficulties. Now I want to go to Ezra chapter 7 and verse 10. The text says that Ezra prepared his heart. Have you prepared your heart? The text says he prepared his heart to seek the law of God and to do it. That's what he prepared his heart to do. So he didn't just seek the law of God, but he prepared his heart that he might seek the law of God and do the will of God. And I want to suggest to you that that would include preparing for the challenges that are involved. Then when I seek the law of God and I do the law of God, there are going to be some challenges that are ahead. The Bible tells us and warns us that those who live godly will suffer persecution. 2 Timothy 3 verse 12. That was in our study last Sunday morning. So all who live godly face some obstacles. And so you say, I want to live godly, and I've entered the Christian life, but I'm suddenly surprised by the obstacles that I have. You shouldn't be, because those who live godly, if you prepare your heart, you'll know those who live godly suffer persecution. God chastens every son he receives, Hebrews 12 and in verse 6. That means every child of God receives a chastening. That in the context deals with persecution, some obstacle, some pressure and force against you. So what I'm learning from that is that if you've understood somehow that a Christian shouldn't face any difficulties in following his faith, you were greatly misinformed. If you thought being a Christian means it's going to be smooth sailing and I'm not going to have an obstacle I have to get over and a hurdle I have to jump, somebody misinformed you on that. So why do people give up? Well, some people give up because simply they were not preparing their hearts for the obstacles that are ahead. Number 3, why do people give up? One of the reasons people give up is that we do not attempt to succeed with all of our might. Some goals, I suggest to you, cannot be achieved without giving it everything you have. Maybe some goals can be. But there are some goals in life you can never achieve unless you give it everything you have. Now listen to this carefully. Those that are giving the service of God all they have never quit. I've never known of one to throw up their hands and quit while at the same time they were giving their Christianity everything they have. They were putting every ounce of energy into being a Christian and serving God. Those that quit have stopped giving it their all long before they ever called it quits. Long before they pull out the white flag and begin to wave. They've quit giving it their all. We must serve God with all of our might. Let's go over to 2 Chronicles and read about Hezekiah in 2 Chronicles chapter 31 and in verse 21. See if this describes you. This was King Hezekiah. Hezekiah, verse 20 said, throughout all Judah, thus Hezekiah did throughout all Judah, and he did what was good and right and true before the Lord his God. Now what else does it say? in every work that he began in the service in the house of the Lord, in the law and in the commandment, to seek his God, he did it with all his heart, so he prospered. What does that tell me? That tells me that what he did it with all of his heart. He put some life and some vitality into that. Ecclesiastes 9 in verse 10, you are familiar with what your hand finds to do. Do it with all of your might. That includes the service of God. Colossians 3:23 says, any service to God should be done heartily with life and with vitality. Our service to God means we give it everything we have. Why do some people give up? Because they're not attempting to succeed with all of their might. Why is it that people give up? We give up, number 4, because we do not lay aside every weight and sin. Because we do not lay aside every weight and sin. Often the problem is that one who quits has something they just don't want to give up. They may not admit that, they may not even recognize that themselves, but there's something in their life they may not want to give up. It may involve some relationship. It may be a marriage they can't give up. That's unscriptural. It may be a relationship to a friend. It may be someone they're dating. They don't want to cut that off because of the immorality involved. It may involve some immoral thing within itself. It may be homosexuality that they don't want to give up. It may be drinking they don't want to give up. It may be the life of lying they don't want to quit. There's something they don't want to quit. And consequently, they're not willing to lay aside every weight in sin. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 12. In Hebrews chapter 12, it pictures living the Christian life and being faithful like running a race. And he says that we're surrounded by a great cloud of witness. That's a picture of sitting in the stands of the field, track and field, where the crowds are standing around watching. And they give testimony that what you're about to do, you can do that. And then he said, let us lay aside every weight and sin which does so easily ensnare us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. As a runner running a race throws aside every weight and anything that may be an impediment or a hindrance to running the race. So he's saying we must carry no extra weight at all, but lay aside every weight and every sin. Let's go to 1 John chapter 5 and in verse 4. What I see in that text is faith is the victory that overcomes the world. Here's what I'm learning from that. I'm learning that sin destroys faith. And faith overcomes sin. They fight against each other. Faith is the victory that overcomes the world. But if I'm holding on to that sin that I don't want to give up, that destroys my faith. And then I'm ready to throw up my hands and quit. Why do some people give up? Because they're not willing to lay aside every weight and every sin. We're talking about why people give up. Number 5, we focus too much on our failures and our shortcomings. You see, sin of the past must be forgiven. In other words, we must obtain forgiveness for our past sin. Whatever we've done in our past, however bad it may be, how many that may be. Why is that? Well, John 8:21 on the screen before you simply says that if you die in your sins, where I go, you cannot come. He's going to heaven. In other words, if you die in sin, die with sin in your account, you can't go to heaven. That's all he says. You're just not going to heaven if you die with sin. But once we have been forgiven, we've met the conditions for forgiveness, we must forget the past and press on for the future. Let's go to Philippians chapter 3. Paul himself admitted this. You remember Paul was a man who had persecuted the church of God. He would mention it, and forgetting it doesn't mean it's not a part of his history. Didn't mean he never talked about that, but he didn't focus on that so that it burdened him down. He forgave himself. Notice what he said in verse 13. Philippians 3 verse 13. Brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended, but one thing I do. What do, Paul? Forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to the things which are ahead. What do you say, Paul? What I'm saying is that once I was forgiven, I forgot the past, and what I do is I focus on the future. What I want to suggest to you is if we continue to focus on our past, we will become discouraged. How so? Suppose someone has had a life of lying. That's all they've done all their life. They lie. They tell lie one after the other. And now they're forgiven, and they recognize and they're ashamed of the fact, I have been so dishonest. I am ashamed of the fact I've been such a dishonest person. That now that they have obtained forgiveness from God, they keep reminding themselves how terrible they were. And they're still saying, I was such a terrible person. I'm not sure I could even make it to heaven being such a terrible, dishonest person that I was. Rather than forgiving themselves. Why do some people give up? Because they're focused on their failures and their shortcomings. We're talking about why people give up. And number 6 is that we do not learn from our own mistakes or from the mistakes of others. We fail to learn from the mistakes of others and from our own mistakes. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and notice that we are encouraged, and the Corinthians were encouraged to learn from the failure of the Israelites. Notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he said, "Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that our fathers," that's the Israelites, "were all into the cloud and passed through the sea, and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea." That is, they came out of Egypt and they entered into the land of the wilderness. And they all ate of that same spiritual food, and they drank of that same spiritual drink. And they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now notice verse 6, "These things became our example to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted." In other words, they came out of their land of Egypt and they entered into the wilderness having passed through the sea, and they died before they made it to the promised land. The warning is it could happen to you. Learn from their failure and don't do the same thing. You may come out of your bondage and pass through the waters of baptism, but not make it to your promised land. That's his point. Let's notice another verse over in Jude verse 5. Jude verse 5. I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, and He took care of them, He brought them out of the land of Egypt. We just read about that. Afterward destroyed those who did not believe. You see, just because they were once saved doesn't mean they made it to their promised land. And we ought to learn from their mistakes. But we fail sometimes to do that. I want to suggest to you we should learn from our own mistakes. This is the example of where the Lord told Peter, He said, "I've prayed for you that your faith not fail." And then He said, "But when you are converted, strengthen your brethren." In other words, Peter, your faith is going to fail. The bottom's going to fall out of your faith. But then you're going to come back to the Lord, and then I want you to go and strengthen your brethren. You'll learn from your mistakes. What I want to suggest to you is if we don't learn from our mistakes and the mistakes of others, we'll repeat those same mistakes, and it will result in failure, and we'll end up throwing up our hands and quitting. Why do we sometimes give up? We fail to learn from the mistakes of others and our own mistakes. We're talking about why people give up. Number 7. We do not receive any encouragement, but only ridicule. Some are ready to throw up their hands and quit because they don't feel like they're being encouraged. They feel like that every time they turn around, they're being ridiculed. Maybe because of their faith. And they're ready to throw up their hands and quit. The Bible tells us that encouragement is necessary to keep pressing on. Let's notice this in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 24. This is not just a passage that happens to mention that. This was written to people who were discouraged. This was written to people who were discouraged. The whole point of the letter is to encourage them. And notice at verse 24, "Let us consider one another in order to stir up to love and good works." In other words, encourage one another. Notice verse 25, "Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another." We need encouragement. If we don't, we may throw up our hands and quit. Turn to 1 Thessalonians with me, if you will. And in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11, the text says, "Therefore comfort each other and edify one another just as you are also doing." In other words, I know you're already encouraging each other. Keep on encouraging one another. You need that encouragement. Let's turn to Acts chapter 11. This is an important point. Someone urging you to be faithful is not discouraging, but it's encouraging. You say, "Well, it's not very encouraging to me." Well, that may be how you view that, but notice in Acts chapter 11, this is how God labeled it, and that's how I know it's true. Notice in Acts chapter 11, Barnabas went to Antioch to seek for Saul and brought him back to Antioch. Now, when they get there, look at verse 23. When he came and had seen the grace of God, he was glad, and he encouraged them all. There's our word, encouraged. That with purpose of heart they should continue with the Lord. What's Paul doing when he gets there? He's telling them, you need to continue to be faithful. You need to continue to be faithful. You need to continue to be faithful. And you need to continue to be faithful. And the text labels that as encouraging them. Forget about spiritual things for a moment and picture you have joined a health club. And you're getting healthier and you're losing weight, and then you just kind of drop off and you maybe only show up once every 6 weeks. And when you show up that next time, people come up and say, you need to keep coming back. You need to come more often. You were losing weight. You were getting healthier. You were getting better in your health. You need to keep coming. Come more often. Would you think that's discouraging? Or are they trying to encourage you to better yourself? Well, the same thing is true spiritually when someone maybe has missed a good while and they show up. Someone encourages you need to come more often. Come back tonight. Come back next week. You need to build up your faith. That's encouraging. The Bible labels it as that right here in this text. If you are ridiculed, or at least you feel that way, rather than being encouraged, you'll want to quit. Why do people give up? Number 8, we're ready to throw up our hands and quit when we don't focus on the reward of our efforts. We're ready to throw up our hands and quit when we don't focus on the rewards for our efforts. If we focus on the present, we're not looking at the rewards of the future. In other words, we're going through whatever trial, or maybe we're not going through a trial. Maybe it's just that I'm just focused on the here and the now. I'm not focused on the future. I'm not focused on heaven. I'm not looking at the rewards of heaven. The faithful have the hope of eternal life. Notice in Galatians 6 and verse 9, we'll reap if we do not lose heart. That is, don't give up. Don't wave the white flag. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 58, they were to be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as you know your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Those who are diligent, those who are faithful have the hope of eternal life. Hebrews chapter 6. Turn with me to Hebrews chapter 6 for a moment. Look at verse 10. In Hebrews chapter 6 verses 10 through 12, if we are diligent, we are assured of that hope. For God is not unjust, Hebrews 6:10. God is not unjust to forget your work and labor of love which you've shown toward His name, in that you minister to the saints and do minister. And we desire that each one of you show the same diligence of full assurance of hope until the end. Those who are faithful, those who don't give up, have that assurance of hope. Hebrews 10 verse 35, confidence has a great reward. Do not cast away your confidence. We alluded to that in Bible class this morning. Don't cast away that confidence. Don't throw it down like a shield you're not going to use anymore, which has great reward, the text says. That has great reward. Why do we sometimes quit? Because we're not focused on the reward of our efforts. We're talking about why people give up. Number 9. Because we have not noticed that others with fewer advantages have succeeded. Now let's notice an example of this in Matthew chapter 12 and in verse 41. Jesus said the men of Nineveh repented at the preaching of Jonah, and then he added, but greater than Jonah is here. Now you think about that. Jonah went to Nineveh. Jonah was nothing like the Christ. Couldn't do anything like the Christ could do. And yet he goes to Nineveh and the people repented. And yet greater than Jonah, greater opportunity was right present with these people, and they were not repenting. So what am I learning from that? The men of Nineveh repented with less opportunity than those that heard Jesus. They had greater opportunity. Go to Hebrews chapter 12 with me. And as you're turning to Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 4, you might take a glance over chapter 11, which is Faith's Hall of Fame, these great examples of faith. These were faithful, diligent people. These Old Testament characters are presented as facing more obstacles than the Hebrews faced. Notice that some of them were killed even. And then in chapter 12, verse 4, you have not yet resisted unto blood. In other words, you haven't had it as bad as some of those people have had it. So don't throw up your hands and quit. You have greater advantage and more opportunity than they had. I want to suggest to you that there are many in the present day who have remained diligent and faithful with far less advantage and far more problems than you may be facing. If you're tempted to say, you know what, I'm just discouraged, I'm ready to just throw up my hands and quit. Do you realize there are people that have less opportunity and more problems than you're dealing with that remain faithful in the midst of all of that than what you're dealing with? So why do people give up? We sometimes are not noticing that others have fewer advantages and they have succeeded quite well. We're talking about why people give up. Here's number 10. Because we forget the words of Jesus that with God all things are possible. Matthew 19 and verse 26. We'll come back to that phrase in just a moment. We do not face whatever challenges we have alone. We have the help of God. Philippians 4:13, Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Whatever circumstance I'm in, whatever problem I'm facing, whatever trial I have to overcome, whatever challenge I have before me, I can do it with the help of God. I'm not doing this alone, I have the help of God. In fact, 1 Peter 5 and verse 7 encourages us to take our cares to God. That is, cast your cares upon Him because He cares for you. Whatever concerns you have, you bring them to God. Now let's turn to Luke chapter 17 and notice that with God, I can do what may seem to be impossible. Now, let's talk about your impossibility, then let's come back to the text and make some application from it. You may say, you know what, being diligent like you're telling us to be, like the Bible, I think that's just almost impossible. I'm not sure I can do it. You don't know my family circumstance. It's just almost impossible to press on and be diligent. It's almost impossible to serve the Lord every Sunday. It's just almost impossible to overcome the discouragement of my family. You just don't know how it is. Let's go to Luke chapter 17, verse 6. The disciples here in this context thought it was almost impossible to be forgiving up until 7 times in the same day. The Lord said, verse 4, that if He returns to you saying, I repent, that is after 7 times the same day, you shall forgive. And they thought it's a little hard. Because they said at verse 5, increase our faith. Now notice what Jesus said at verse 6. That if you have the faith as a grain of a mustard seed, you shall say to the mulberry tree, be pulled up by the roots, and it shall be planted in the sea, and it'll obey you. Is He saying that if you have faith, you can literally go over here to the mulberry tree and say, oh, I want to see you jump out of the ground, and then it's going to be cast in the sea? No. That's something impossible. But what He's saying is, with faith, you can do what seems to be impossible, like forgiving 7 times in the same day. Like your challenge, whatever it may be, being faithful with family pressure against you. You can do with faith what may seem to be impossible. That's the point. You see, when you begin to reason, I don't think I can. I'm not sure I can do this. We need to remember that with God, all things are possible, Matthew 19 and in verse 26. We're talking about why people give up. Number 11. Because we spend too much time trying to analyze the problem rather than doing something about the problem. I like what Martin Luther King Jr. said. He said, we get bogged down with the paralysis of analysis. I like that. Where we're analyzing rather than doing something about the problem. We must look for solution and choices. If the problem you're dealing with involves salvation, involves your salvation, the time is now. Now is accepted time. Now's the time to deal with it. If it involves your salvation, not later, now's the time. Don't just analyze, deal with the problem. If it involves sin, it needs immediate attention. John 8:21, if you die in sin, where I go, you can't come. So you say, I've got a problem. Does it involve sin? Yeah, it involves sin. It needs immediate attention because your soul's in danger. If it involves the fact that you've done something wrong, you need to correct it. You need to confess your faults one toward another. James 5, verse 16. You've done something wrong? Acknowledge it. Correct it. Confess it to God and before others. If you've been done wrong, that's my problem. I've been mistreated. I've been done wrong. Then you need to tell them that, Matthew 18. Go and tell the one that has done you wrong, the fault between him and thee alone. If you're discouraged, You say, I'm just discouraged. Not that I did wrong. It's not that someone else did me wrong, but I'm just discouraged generally. Then seek out encouragement. Start looking for a solution and choices. If there's a problem that tempts you to quit, start acting on it rather than just analyzing that I've got a problem. I don't know what to do about the problem. We're talking about why people give up. Why do people quit? Number 12. We forget that God has commanded us to do certain things. We forget that God has commanded us to do certain things. Now, I want to suggest to you that when God has commanded us, we have no choice. What I mean by that is we have no choice, that God doesn't say, well, you can either obey or disobey me. I don't really care which way. But when God has commanded something, like a parent commanding a child, the child has no choice. Now, we do have the choice to obey or disobey and face the consequence. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. You see, the one that does the will of God has hope. So I have no choice when God has commanded a thing. God has commanded faithful service. Be thou faithful unto death, and I'll give thee a crown of life. So God has commanded me to be diligent. God has commanded me to be faithful. So when I'm ready to throw up my hands and quit it, maybe I've forgotten that God has commanded me to be faithful unto death. You see, when I'm thinking about quitting, I need to remember this statement of Jesus. Luke 22, verse 42, not my will, but yours be done. I don't want to do my will. I don't want to serve myself, but I want to do what you want me to do. We're talking about why people give up. Number 13. We try too early in the process or in our labors to assess how well we're doing. It's easy to become discouraged in the early stages of any endeavor. Maybe you take a new job, and the first few hours you decide, I can't do this job. Maybe you ought to give it a little time. You want to learn a new subject, so you take a class, and the first class is overwhelming. Maybe you ought to give it a little more time because you're assessing that too early in the process. The same thing is true spiritually. This applies to learning the Scriptures. You say, I don't know anything about Revelation, and you endeavor to study Revelation, and your first approach to that may be kind of overwhelming to you. Same thing with some of the prophets. Same thing with true with any book, maybe Romans, Hebrews. Maybe you take an assessment too early in the process. It applies to living the Christian life. You start living the Christian life and you say, you know what, this is hard. This is overwhelming to me. I don't know if I can do that. Maybe you ought to give it a little time. It may apply to overcoming some sin. You're trying to overcome some sin. You say that the temptation is too strong. I don't think I can do this. Maybe you're taking an assessment too early in the process. We need to give it some time and some opportunity. Look at Luke chapter 13. We need to give the matter some time and need to give it some opportunity. This is an interesting story, the parable of the barren fig tree in Luke chapter 13, beginning at verse 6. So let's start at verse 6, and then we'll see the point down at verse 8 in a moment. That he spoke this parable and said, a certain man had a fig tree that he planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it, and he found none. And he said to the keeper of the vineyard, look, for 3 years I came seeking fruit on the fig tree and found none. Cut it down. And why does it use up the ground? I'm ready to get rid of it. But he answered and said to him, sir, let it alone this year also until I dig around and fertilize. In other words, give it opportunity. Let's give it a little time. And if it bears fruit well, and after that you can cut it down. Well, that may not be the main point of the parable, but what I want you to see is that maybe we need to give things time and opportunity. Maybe give it a little time, maybe I'll learn the Scriptures better. Maybe given time I can be more diligent. Maybe given a little more time I can overcome my sin. Don't call it quits too early. Some people quit because they're analyzing too early their labors. We're talking about why people give up. Number 14. We open our ears repetitively to those that advise us to quit. Now, they may not say it in those words, you need to quit. They may. But they may word it another way. They may give you some bad advice. Remember, Job's wife gave him some bad advice? She said to him, curse God and die. Whatever that may mean. Whatever interpretation you put on that, you can't put a spin on it where she was telling him to do something good. That was bad advice. And there are people who give you bad advice. You may hear exhortation to just give up. They may tell you, you know what, it won't work. I've tried that before. I've seen people try it before, and you can't do it. You can't quit that sin. Or they may tell you, you can't live the Christian life like they're trying to tell you to live. They may tell you it's too hard. They may even tell you nobody at church really cares about you. And they're just trying to get to control of you by telling you need to quit your sin, go to church all the time. And so they may be encouraging you to quit. You see, when Peter gave bad admonition to the Lord, though it was well intended, the Lord rebuked him. Remember what the Lord said to him? Go to Matthew chapter 16. The Lord was telling the disciple what was about to happen to him. And notice in chapter 16, beginning at verse 21, the Lord said that he was going to be mistreated, suffer many things by the hands of the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed and raised the third day. And Peter rebuked him and said, "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall not happen to you." That was well intended. But the Lord said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." He gave some bad advice. He gave some bad admonition. We must not listen to that kind of admonition and that kind of encouragement that encourages us to quit. We're talking about why people give up, number 15 and the last for this morning, and we'll continue the list even this evening. Number 15 is we don't realize that the just shall live by faith and that we walk by faith and not by sight. Now, we may understand the Bible says that, but we're not focused on that. Now, let's start with this, that faith is not a blind shot in the dark. Some people have the idea that if you have faith, it's just a blind shot in the dark. In other words, you just decide, you know what, I think I'm going to believe in God. I think I'm going to believe the Bible is true. Romans 10:17 says, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Faith is based upon evidence. Faith is based upon evidence. Look at Acts chapter 1. As Luke begins his second treatise, he said, to whom also, speaking of Christ, to whom also presented himself alive after his suffering by many infallible proofs, being seen by them 40 days. In other words, he was raised from the dead, and the resurrected body was evidence that indeed he was raised and that he was true, and that what he had said about himself was true. The empty tomb gave proof of that. Faith was not a blind shot into the dark. Go to Romans 1 and in verse 17. The just live by faith. The faith, that is, those who are justified, are living by their faith. Furthermore, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7, we walk by faith and not by sight. Now, I want us to go to Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 1. Get the main point I want you to see from Hebrews chapter 11. We walk by faith. The just shall live by faith. Here's what I want you to see in Hebrews 11 in verse 1. That with faith we have confidence of things that we hope for. The text says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Robinson's translation, McGarvey said this was the best translation he ever saw of this verse. Faith is the confidence, faith is confidence as to things hoped for, conviction as to things not seen. That is, the things that we hope for, faith gives us that confidence in that, and furthermore, faith gives us conviction of things we don't see. That is, if we understand that just walk by faith, live by faith, and we walk by faith and not by sight, then we're not going to be those who are quitters. Go to Hebrews chapter 11. I'm not going to turn and read that, but I want you to see the point for Hebrews 11 verses 10 through 16, that Abraham and others in that context never quit, or they wouldn't be mentioned in the Faith Hall of Fame. They didn't quit even though they died without seeing the promise fulfilled. Much of the promise was yet to be fulfilled at the point of their death, which means they were living by faith and they were walking by faith and not by sight. So why do we sometimes throw up our hands and quit? One of the reasons is we're not understanding and not focused on the fact we're walking by faith and not by sight, and that we live by faith and then we indeed are justified. We've listed 15 reasons why, and we're going to continue that list in our study this evening. But why do people quit? Why people give up? Why do they finally throw up their hands and quit? That's happened a number of times. These are some of the reasons why people throw up their hands and quit. Maybe that encourages you not to throw up your hands and quit. Maybe you're on the verge of that and that keeps you from doing that. Or maybe this will help you as you talk to somebody else and encourage them Not to go into the direction of being a quitter and throwing up their hands and quitting, but serving the Lord faithfully and diligently unto the end. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and while we sing?